I came home late that night, expecting the usual calm that greeted me after a long day at the firm. Instead, I was met with chaos. The living room, once pristine and meticulously arranged, looked like a war zone. Paintings that once adorned the walls were scattered across the floor, some leaning haphazardly against the furniture, others lying face down, their frames chipped and scuffed. The coffee table was buried under a mess of papers, brochures, and what looked like torn-up sketches. A vase had tipped over, its water seeping into the Persian rug, while the flowers lay wilted and forgotten. I stood in the doorway, stunned, trying to make sense of the scene in front of me. This wasn't like Jane. She was always so precise, so careful with everything she touched. But the disorder in the room told a different story, one of carelessness or perhaps desperation. "Jane?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. I walked further into the room, stepping over the debris as I headed towards the hallway. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she had a rough day, or maybe she was trying to rearrange the space and had given up midway. But as I noticed her suitcase lying open by the bedroom door, its contents spilling out like a guilty confession, I knew this was something else entirely. She had only just returned from Paris that morning, and I hadn't even had a chance to ask her how it went. I'd been too busy with meetings, deadlines, and the constant buzz of clients to notice the look in her eyes when she walked through the door. Now, standing in the aftermath of whatever had happened, I cursed myself for not paying more attention. I moved towards the suitcase, crouching down to pick up a silk scarf that had slipped out. It was one of her favorites, deep burgundy, with intricate gold embroidery. I remembered the day I bought it for her in Florence, during a weekend getaway that now seemed like a lifetime ago. Back when things were simpler, back when I still felt like I knew the woman I married. As I straightened up, my hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the floor. I looked down and saw Jane's phone, lying there as if it had been dropped in haste. The screen was still lit, and a notification banner flickered across it. Curiosity gnawed at me, and despite the voice in my head telling me to leave it alone, I picked up the phone. My heart pounded as I unlocked the screen, feeling like a trespasser in my own home. The message was from someone named Julien. The words on the screen blurred as my mind raced, connecting the dots I hadn't wanted to see before. Paris, the sudden distance between us, the mess she'd left behind. It all started to make a sick kind of sense. I swiped up, scrolling through the conversation, and with each line I read, the truth came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the aftermath of an affair. And now, all the pieces were finally falling into place, though they were far from fitting together. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of our life together, I knew that everything had changed. It all began innocently enough. Jane had been invited to Paris for one of the most prestigious art exhibitions of the year. Her name was becoming known in the art world, and this was her chance to cement that reputation. I remember the excitement in her voice when she first told me about the invitation. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime, Jack," she had said, her eyes shining with that familiar spark of ambition. A chance to network with the best in the industry. To showcase my work on a global stage. I was proud of her, of course. Jane had worked tirelessly to get to where she was. Late nights in her studio, weekends spent at gallery openings, the constant hustle to make her mark, it was all paying off. I didn't hesitate to encourage her to go. "You should do it," I told her, smiling as I imagined her in Paris, standing among the elite, her art on display for the world to see. This could be the next big step in your career. We both knew it meant time apart. But we had done that before. Her trips to LA, my business in Chicago, it was part of our life together. We'd always made it work. So, I kissed her goodbye at the airport, with no idea that I was sending her off to something that would change everything. She called me when she arrived, telling me about the city, the hotel, the excitement she felt. "It's beautiful here, Jack," she said, her voice warm through the phone. "I can't wait to see everything." The exhibition is tomorrow, and there's so much to do. But I'll call you later, okay? Don't worry about me, I replied. Just focus on the exhibition. I'm sure you're going to blow them away. And she did. The next day, her messages were full of the buzz of the event, the people she met, the connections she made, the compliments she received. I could hear the thrill in her voice, the joy of being recognized for her talent. She mentioned a few names, people in the industry I had vaguely heard of, and one name that stood out even then, Julien. He's a gallery owner, she told me. Quite charming, really. He's been in the business for years, and he knows everyone who's anyone in the art world. He even invited me to a private dinner after the exhibition tonight. A small group, but it sounds like a great networking opportunity. I remember feeling a pang of unease, but I brushed it off. This was what she was here for, after all, to meet people, to expand her horizons. That sounds fantastic, Jane, I said, pushing aside the flicker of doubt. You deserve this. Just don't forget to take a moment for yourself while you're there. Of course, she laughed. I promise I'll even send you a picture from the top of the Eiffel Tower. I laughed along with her, picturing her in that moment, glamorous, confident, standing at the center of it all. But there was no picture, and the calls became shorter as the days went on. She was always busy, always heading to another meeting, another event. I tried not to worry, telling myself that she was just caught up in the whirlwind of it all. It was only later, after everything fell apart, that I would look back and see the signs I had missed. The subtle changes in her voice, the way she began to talk about Julien more frequently, the way she seemed more distant, more distracted. At the time, I had chalked it up to exhaustion, to the intensity of the trip. But Paris had done more than just open doors for Jane. It had opened a door to something that should have remained shut. And while I had been proud of her success, I hadn't realized that I was also losing her to a world I couldn't see. To someone I didn't know. As the days in Paris came to an end, I eagerly awaited her return, unaware of the storm she was bringing back with her. Jane's flight from Paris was delayed, which meant I had to wait an extra few hours to see her. I was eager to hear about everything, the exhibition, the people she met, the city itself. But when she finally walked through the door, something felt off. Her smile was there, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked exhausted, not just from the travel, but from something deeper. I chalked it up to the intensity of the trip and welcomed her home with open arms, thinking that everything would return to normal now that she was back. It wasn't until a few days later that she casually mentioned Julien again. We were having dinner, and she was telling me about a new artist she had discovered in Paris, someone she thought had real potential. She mentioned how Julien had introduced them, how he had this knack for finding talent that others overlooked. Julien? I asked, not fully remembering who he was. The gallery owner I told you about, she replied, not looking up from her plate. He's got this incredible eye for art. He knows everyone in the industry. I nodded, trying to be interested, but there was a twinge of something uncomfortable in my chest. I couldn't quite place it at the time. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe just the realization that there was a part of her life in Paris that I couldn't fully understand or be a part of. I pushed the feeling aside, not wanting to spoil our first dinner back together. As the days went by, I noticed that Jane was quieter than usual, often lost in thought. When I asked her about it, she'd smile and tell me she was just tired or that she was thinking about work. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that everything was fine. But there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. One night, about a week after she'd returned, we were lying in bed, and I could tell she wasn't asleep. She was lying still, staring at the ceiling. I reached out to touch her hand, and she flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. Is everything okay, Jane? I asked softly. She turned to me, her eyes wide and a little startled, as if she hadn't realized I was there. Of course, she said quickly, too quickly. I'm just thinking about Paris. It was such an intense experience. I'm still processing it all. I wanted to press her further, to ask her what was really on her mind. But something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I kissed her forehead and pulled her closer, hoping that my touch would bring her back to me. But as the days turned into weeks, the distance only grew. Jane started staying late at the office more often, saying she was catching up on work. I wanted to believe her, but there was a nagging doubt that I couldn't shake. She was more guarded with her phone, more secretive about her messages. The name Julien began to crop up more frequently in her conversations. Always in passing, always with a hint of admiration. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. After all, she was allowed to have friends, colleagues, people she admired. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. It wasn't until much later that I would discover what had really happened that first night in Paris. They had met at the exhibition, as she had told me, but it wasn't just a professional connection. After the exhibition, Julien had invited her out to dinner, an intimate, exclusive dinner at one of the finest restaurants in the city. She hadn't mentioned this detail when she first told me about him. That evening, after the lights of the exhibition had dimmed, they sat in a cozy corner of a dimly lit Parisian restaurant, sipping wine and talking about art, life, and everything in between. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, and she found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in a long time. Julien was charming, yes, but more than that, he made her feel seen. Understood in a way that I hadn't in months. She didn't intend for it to happen, but as the night wore on, the lines blurred between professional admiration and something more. She didn't tell me this, of course. Not at first. But I could sense it, even if I couldn't fully understand it. That night marked the beginning of something that would slowly unravel the fabric of our marriage, thread by thread. Julien was no longer just a name in passing. He was a presence in our lives, a ghost that haunted our home. Our conversations, our bed. And though I couldn't see it then, that first evening together in Paris was the moment when I started losing Jane, when she started slipping away from me, one secret at a time. The morning Jane returned from Paris, I was eager to see her. I had woken up early, made coffee, and tried to create a relaxing atmosphere for her homecoming. I knew the trip had been important for her career, and I wanted to hear all about it. But when she walked through the door, something felt off. She looked different, not physically, but there was a change in her aura. She seemed distant, like part of her was still back in Paris. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, you," I greeted her, pulling her into a hug. "Welcome home." "Thanks," she murmured into my shoulder, but even her hug felt less warm, as if she was holding something back. "It's good to be home. Let me take your bag," I offered, reaching for her suitcase. She hesitated for a moment before handing it over, as if she wasn't ready to let go of it yet. "How was the flight?" I asked, trying to ease the tension. "Long," she replied, running a hand through her hair. "I'm exhausted. I think I'll just take a quick shower." I watched her walk down the hallway, her movements slower than usual. She didn't seem like herself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed while she was away. After her shower, she came back to the kitchen where I had prepared breakfast. She thanked me, but her appetite was gone after a few bites. She kept checking her phone, her fingers twitching whenever it buzzed. I noticed but didn't say anything, telling myself she was just catching up on work. Over the next few days, Jane seemed to settle back into her routine, but the distance between us remained. It was like she had brought something back from Paris that she couldn't share with me, something that was pulling her away. I tried to engage her in conversation, asking about the exhibition, the people she met, the city. She told me about the artists, the galleries, and how successful the event had been. But she was vague, as if she was trying to avoid certain details. She mentioned Julien a few times, casually dropping his name into our conversations like he was just another colleague. But every time she did, I noticed a slight change in her tone, a subtle hesitation that made my stomach tighten. One evening, I suggested we go out for dinner to celebrate her return and the success of the exhibition. She agreed, but I could tell her heart wasn't in it. Throughout the meal, she seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else entirely. I tried to make her laugh, tried to bring her back to me, but it was like there was a wall between us that I couldn't break through. After dinner, as we walked back home, I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, pretending to fix her hair. It was a small gesture, but it cut deep. I couldn't help but wonder if this was just the fallout from the stress of the trip, or if something more sinister was at play. The next day, I decided to surprise her by picking her up from work. I arrived at her office just as she was finishing up a meeting. Through the glass walls, I could see her sitting at the conference table, her attention fixed on something on her laptop. I waited for her to notice me, but she seemed lost in thought. When the meeting ended, she gathered her things and headed for the door. As she stepped out of the conference room, she saw me and froze for a split second before forcing a smile. That hesitation, brief as it was, sent a cold wave of realization through me. "Hey," I greeted her, trying to sound casual. "Thought I'd take you out for lunch." "Oh, that's sweet," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "But I actually have a lot to catch up on here." "Rain check?" "Sure," I said, hiding my disappointment. "Maybe tonight?" "Yeah, maybe," she said, already turning back towards her office. As I watched her walk away, the weight of everything that had been building up finally started to sink in. The late nights, the distracted looks, the constant checking of her phone, it all pointed to something I wasn't ready to admit. That evening, when she came home, I tried to talk to her again, but she brushed me off, saying she was tired. We went to bed in silence, and for the first time, I found myself lying awake, wondering if I had already lost her. In the weeks that followed, the distance between us grew. Jane was always busy, always preoccupied with work, or so she said. The warmth, the connection we once shared, seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a coldness that I didn't know how to thaw. I wanted to believe that it was just a phase, that we could work through it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I just didn't know how to stop it. The unease that had settled in my chest was no longer just a faint whisper, it was a persistent, gnawing anxiety that colored everything. As the days passed, Jane's behavior became more erratic, more difficult to ignore. She was constantly on her phone, and though she tried to hide it, I noticed the subtle shifts in her posture when she received a message, the way she'd turn her body away, the quick glances she'd cast my way before typing out a response. I tried to push the thoughts away, to rationalize her actions. She was busy with work, after all, and I didn't want to be the paranoid husband who couldn't handle his wife's success. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the doubts crept in. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed again. She reached for it quickly, her face lighting up with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time. The corners of her mouth lifted into a smile, and for a moment, she looked like the Jane I used to know, happy, carefree. But the warmth in her eyes wasn't directed at me. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She looked up, startled, as if she had forgotten I was there. "Oh, just work stuff," she said, her voice a little too breezy. She locked the screen and set the phone face down on the coffee table. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but the unease in my stomach tightened. I wanted to reach out, to pull her back to me, but there was an invisible barrier between us, something I couldn't quite touch or see but could feel with every fiber of my being. A few nights later, I was up late, unable to sleep. Jane had gone to bed hours before, saying she was exhausted. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the faint glow of my laptop screen. I found myself staring at Jane's phone, which she had left on the coffee table, charging. My heart pounded as I fought the urge to pick it up, to go through her messages and find out what, or who, had been occupying her thoughts. I knew it was wrong, that it was a violation of her privacy, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand hovered over the phone, trembling slightly as I reached for it. Just as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, The screen lit up with a new message. Julien, thinking about you. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the words on the screen, my mind reeling. The blood drained from my face as I tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just work stuff. This was something far more intimate, far more damaging. I unlocked the phone, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the conversation. Each message was like a knife, cutting deeper into my heart. There were late-night exchanges filled with jokes, shared memories from Paris, and more messages like the one I had just seen, flirtatious, suggestive, full of a familiarity that was meant for lovers, not colleagues. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me free falling into a void of disbelief and anger. The signs had been there all along, but I had been too blind, too trusting to see them. I had let this happen, allowed the distance between us to grow without stopping it. And now, I was faced with the reality that the woman I loved had been slipping away from me. One message at a time. I put the phone down, my hands clammy and my heart racing. I couldn't bring myself to wake her, to confront her right then and there. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do. For the next few days, I watched her more closely, scrutinizing every word, every gesture. I noticed how she'd smile at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, how she seemed more distant, more preoccupied than ever before. The tension between us grew thicker, and I could feel the strain in every interaction. Every touch that felt more like a formality than an expression of love. I started coming home early, hoping to catch her off guard, to see if there was anything else I had missed. But she was always one step ahead, always careful to cover her tracks. It was as if she knew I was onto her, and she was determined not to let me find out more than I already had. The worst part was the silence, the unspoken words that hung between us, heavy and suffocating. We still went through the motions of our life together. But the connection we once shared was gone, replaced by a coldness that neither of us seemed willing or able to thaw. I knew I had to confront her, to ask her directly about Julien and what was really going on. But every time I tried to bring it up, the words caught in my throat, my fear of hearing the truth outweighing my need to know. I wasn't ready to face what was happening to us, to acknowledge that our marriage was crumbling beneath the weight of secrets and lies. But I couldn't ignore it forever. The truth was there, staring me in the face, waiting for me to finally open my eyes and see it. And when I did, I knew there would be no going back. Chapter 6, Confrontation. The day I decided to confront Jane, I felt like I was walking into a battle I wasn't prepared for. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend I hadn't seen the messages, to go on living in the shadow of a lie. But I couldn't. The truth was too heavy, too insistent to ignore any longer. It was a Saturday afternoon. Jane had been out all morning, running errands, or at least that's what she'd told me. I had spent those hours pacing the house, rehearsing what I was going to say, how I was going to approach her. But no matter how many times I went over it in my head, I couldn't find the right words. When she finally walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the phone that was now back in my possession. The same phone that had betrayed me, revealed the truth I hadn't wanted to see. "Hey," she greeted me, her voice light as she set down her bag. "I picked up some groceries. Thought I'd make us dinner tonight." I looked up at her, my heart pounding in my chest. She seemed so normal, so composed, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. "Jane, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She paused, her back to me as she unloaded the groceries onto the counter. "Sure," she replied, her tone casual, but I saw the slight tension in her shoulders. The way she hesitated before turning to face me. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I saw the messages, Jane." Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks in an instant. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stood there, frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights. "Julien," I said, the name bitter on my tongue. I saw everything. For a moment, There was silence. Thick, suffocating silence that filled the space between us. I watched as her expression shifted from shock to something else. Guilt, shame, maybe even fear. Jack, she began, but I cut her off. Don't, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't lie to me. Not now. She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the counter. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not this time. The pain in my chest was too raw, too overwhelming. I didn't mean for it to happen. She finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just a stupid mistake. A mistake? I repeated, the word echoing in my head. Is that what you call it? A mistake? She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she struggled to find the right words. I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen, Jane. You made a choice, I said, my voice cold, detached. You chose him. Her tears fell harder now, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. It wasn't like that, she pleaded, her voice breaking. It wasn't serious. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything? I asked, my anger flaring. Then why did you keep it from me? Why did you lie? She didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure if there was one that could satisfy the aching void in my chest. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. Sorry doesn't fix this, Jane. Sorry doesn't change what you did. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. What do you want me to do, Jack? Tell me how to fix this. Tell me how to make it right. But I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know how to fix something that felt so broken, so irreparably damaged. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me wasn't the Jane I thought I knew. She was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize anymore. I don't know, I said, my voice hollow. I don't know if you can. She flinched at my words, as if I had struck her. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore, unable to see the person who had torn my world apart. I need some time, I said, my back still to her. I need to figure out what this means for us. There was a long pause, the silence stretching out between us like a chasm. Finally, I heard her take a shaky breath. I understand, she whispered. Take as much time as you need. Without another word, I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, leaving her standing there alone. I didn't know where I was going, or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't be in that house, with her, in that moment. I needed space to think, to process, to decide what was left of our marriage, if anything. As I drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my shoulders. The confrontation had left me drained, hollow, and unsure of what the future held. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be. The day I decided to confront Jane, I felt like I was walking into a battle I wasn't prepared for. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend I hadn't seen the messages, to go on living in the shadow of a lie. But I couldn't. The truth was too heavy, too insistent to ignore any longer. It was a Saturday afternoon. Jane had been out all morning, running errands, or at least that's what she'd told me. I had spent those hours pacing the house, rehearsing what I was going to say, how I was going to approach her. But no matter how many times I went over it in my head, I couldn't find the right words. When she finally walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the phone that was now back in my possession. The same phone that had betrayed me, revealed the truth I hadn't wanted to see. Hey, she greeted me, her voice light as she set down her bag. I picked up some groceries. Thought I'd make us dinner tonight. I looked up at her, my heart pounding in my chest. She seemed so normal, so composed, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. Jane, We need to talk, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She paused, her back to me as she unloaded the groceries onto the counter. Sure, she replied, her tone casual, but I saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she hesitated before turning to face me. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I saw the messages, Jane. Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks in an instant. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stood there, frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights. Julien, I said, the name bitter on my tongue. I saw everything. For a moment, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence that filled the space between us. I watched as her expression shifted from shock to something else. Guilt, shame, maybe even fear. Jack, she began, but I cut her off. Don't, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't lie to me. Not now. She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the counter. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not this time. The pain in my chest was too raw, too overwhelming. I didn't mean for it to happen, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just a stupid mistake. A mistake? I repeated, the word echoing in my head. Is that what you call it? A mistake? She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she struggled to find the right words. I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did happen, Jane. You made a choice, I said, my voice cold, detached. You chose him. Her tears fell harder now, her shoulders shaking as she tried to compose herself. It wasn't like that, she pleaded, her voice breaking. It wasn't serious. It didn't mean anything. It didn't mean anything? I asked, my anger flaring. Then why did you keep it from me? Why did you lie? She didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure if there was one that could satisfy the aching void in my chest. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I stood up from the table, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. Sorry doesn't fix this. Jane. Sorry doesn't change what you did. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. What do you want me to do, Jack? Tell me how to fix this. Tell me how to make it right. But I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know how to fix something that felt so broken, so irreparably damaged. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me wasn't the Jane I thought I knew. She was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize anymore. I don't know, I said, my voice hollow. I don't know if you can. She flinched at my words, as if I had struck her. I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore, unable to see the person who had torn my world apart. I need some time, I said, my back still to her. I need to figure out what this means for us. There was a long pause, the silence stretching out between us like a chasm. Finally, I heard her take a shaky breath. I understand, she whispered. Take as much time as you need. Without another word, I walked out of the kitchen. Out of the house, leaving her standing there alone. I didn't know where I was going, or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't be in that house, with her, in that moment. I needed space to think, to process, to decide what was left of our marriage, if anything. As I drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my shoulders. The confrontation had left me drained, hollow, and unsure of what the future held. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur. I spent most of my time away from the house, trying to distance myself from the storm that had torn through my life. I stayed at a hotel across town, unable to face the reality of going back home. The thought of seeing Jane, of pretending that everything was normal, was unbearable. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. But no matter how far I ran, the questions followed me. Why Julien? Why now? What had driven her to betray me like this? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she had told me. Something deeper that she was hiding. So I did what I do best, I started digging. I knew Julien was an art gallery owner in Paris, someone Jane had met during the exhibition. But that was all I knew, and it wasn't enough. I needed to understand who he was. What kind of man had managed to wedge himself between my wife and me? Using my connections, I began to gather information about him. At first, it was simple enough. Just basic details, things I could find online or through mutual acquaintances in the art world. Julien Arnaud, a man in his late 30s, had built a reputation for himself as a charming and successful gallery owner with a keen eye for emerging talent. He was well connected, well liked, and by all accounts, very charismatic. But the more I dug, the more I started to uncover a different side of him, a side that wasn't so polished. There were whispers about his personal life, rumors about affairs with other married women, scandals that had been quietly covered up. He was a master of playing the game, of manipulating people to get what he wanted. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't the first husband to find himself on the wrong side of Julien Arnaud's charm. There was a pattern, a trail of broken marriages and ruined reputations left in his wake. He wasn't just some harmless flirt. He was a predator, someone who thrived on the thrill of conquest, of taking what wasn't his. The rage that had been simmering inside me began to boil over. This wasn't just about Jane's betrayal anymore. This was about a man who had made it his mission to destroy lives, and he had set his sights on mine. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. But I knew I couldn't confront him directly, not yet. I needed to be strategic, to use the same patience and precision that had made me successful in my career. I started reaching out to my contacts in the art world, carefully asking about Julien without raising suspicion. I wanted to know everything: his business dealings, his finances, his reputation among his peers. I wanted to find his weaknesses, the places where he was most vulnerable. As I dug deeper, I found them. Behind the facade of success, there were cracks in Julien's empire. He had debts, deals that had gone sour, investors who were losing patience. He was teetering on the edge, holding it all together with charm and bluster. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. I began to form a plan. If I could exploit those weaknesses, I could bring him down. I could make sure he paid for what he had done, not just to me, but to every other family he had destroyed. I wasn't just going to ruin his reputation. I was going to destroy his life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. But I knew I had to be careful. Julien was smart, and if he caught wind of what I was doing, he'd find a way to slip out of it, just like he had done before. I needed to move slowly, to gather every bit of information I could, to make sure that when I finally struck, there would be no way for him to recover. I started by planting seeds of doubt among his investors, feeding them subtle hints about his financial instability. I made calls, sent anonymous tips, anything to shake their confidence in him. I knew it wouldn't take much, just a few well-placed doubts, and they'd start to pull away, leaving him more vulnerable than ever. At the same time, I reached out to journalists I knew, encouraging them to dig into Julien's past. I fed them stories, half-truths mixed with enough verifiable facts to pique their interest. I knew that once the media got hold of it, they'd start to uncover the rest, the scandals that had been buried, the affairs that had been hushed up. Julien's carefully curated image would begin to crumble, and there would be nothing he could do to stop it. But I wasn't done. I needed to hit him where it hurt the most, his reputation in the art world. I started contacting artists who had worked with him, subtly suggesting that they distance themselves from his gallery. I let it slip that other galleries were interested in their work, galleries with better reputations, more stable finances. It wasn't long before I started to hear back. Artists were pulling out of exhibitions, taking their work elsewhere. The word was spreading, and Julien's gallery was becoming toxic. Through it all, I kept my distance from Jane. I needed to focus, to keep my mind clear. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Julien had taken something from me, something that could never be repaired, and I was going to make sure he paid for it. As the pieces of my plan started to fall into place, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. I was in control, for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Julien Arnaud had thought he could take what was mine and walk away unscathed. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Orm of an article. It wasn't a front-page story, not yet, but it was enough to start the ripple. The headline read, "Parisian gallery owner under fire, allegations of misconduct surface." It was a small piece, buried in the art section of a local newspaper, but it had the right kind of bite. A few choice quotes from anonymous sources, insinuations about Julien's professional and personal life, and just enough truth to make it stick. I could almost see Julien's reaction as he read it. His carefully constructed world starting to tilt off its axis. The man had built his reputation on charm and connections, and now that reputation was under siege. The article was only the beginning, it planted the seeds of doubt, and I knew how quickly those seeds could grow into something much larger, something uncontrollable. The following days brought more articles, each one digging a little deeper, unearthing more of Julien's past. Reporters started reaching out to former employees, past lovers, anyone who might have a story to tell. And there were plenty of stories, tales of manipulation, of backroom deals, of artists pressured into unfavorable contracts. The whispers I had fed to the press were growing louder, and soon, they would be impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just the media that was turning against Julien. Investors, already nervous from the financial rumors I'd sown, began pulling out of deals. His gallery, once the darling of the Parisian art scene, started losing its luster. Artists withdrew their work, exhibitions were cancelled, and potential buyers began to steer clear. The gallery's sleek facade was cracking, revealing the rot beneath. I watched from a distance, monitoring the fallout with a cold sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just Julien who was feeling the pressure. His staff, once loyal, began to see the writing on the wall. Resignations started piling up on his desk. Without a strong team to support him, Julien's workload became overwhelming. The stress was taking its toll, and it showed. His polished appearance began to falter, the charming smile that had disarmed so many now strained and forced. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. I had reached out to a prominent artist who had once been closely associated with Julien, a rising star in the art world. His departure from Julien's gallery a few years back had been sudden and unexplained, and I had a feeling there was more to the story. After a few discreet conversations, I learned the truth. Julien had sabotaged the artist's career when he refused to sign an exclusive contract. It was the kind of story that would destroy Julien if it got out. I arranged for the artist to meet with a journalist I trusted, someone who would handle the story with the delicacy it required. When the article broke, it was devastating. The headline read, "Gallery owner accused of career sabotage, a tale of betrayal in the art world." The artist laid everything bare, describing how Julien had undermined his work, spread false rumors, and used his connections to blacklist him from major galleries. The story was picked up by larger outlets, snowballing into a full-blown scandal. The Paris art scene was abuzz with the news. Julien Arnaud, the man who had once been the gatekeeper of so many careers, was now being vilified in the same circles that had once celebrated him. His gallery, already struggling, was now on the brink of collapse. Investors demanded their money back, artists publicly condemned him. And his reputation was in shambles. I knew it was only a matter of time before the gallery shut its doors for good. And Jane? She watched it all unfold with a mixture of shock and horror. She hadn't spoken much about Julien since our confrontation, but I could see the guilt and regret in her eyes whenever the news mentioned his name. The man she had risked everything for was being dismantled piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. One evening, as we sat in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife, she finally broke down. Did you Did you have something to do with this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, seeing the woman I had once loved, the woman who had shattered my trust, now filled with fear and uncertainty. I didn't answer her right away. I let the question hang in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between us. Why does it matter? I finally said, my voice calm, measured. He got what he deserved. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She knew, deep down, that I was right. Julien had made his choices, just as she had made hers, and now they were both facing the consequences. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of peace. Julien's collapse was nearly complete, and the man who had thought he could take what was mine was now paying the price. But with that peace came an emptiness, a hollow place where my love for Jane had once been. I had won the battle, but the victory felt cold, hollow. The pieces of my life were still scattered, and even though Julien was no longer a threat, I wasn't sure if they could ever be put back together. The morning after Julien's gallery officially closed, I woke up feeling a strange mixture of triumph and loss. I had destroyed him, utterly and completely. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now a pariah, his name tarnished beyond repair, his career in ruins. But as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the early morning sounds of the city outside, I couldn't shake the emptiness that gnawed at me. Julien was finished, but so was I, or at least the person I used to be. The rage that had fueled my every move over the past few weeks was gone, leaving behind a void I didn't know how to fill. The victory I had sought so desperately now felt like ashes in my mouth. I climbed out of bed, heading downstairs to the kitchen. Jane was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching mine for something. Reassurance, maybe, or forgiveness. I wasn't sure I had either to give. "Morning," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Morning," I replied, my tone neutral as I poured myself a cup of coffee. We hadn't spoken much since her question about my involvement in Julien's downfall. I hadn't given her a straight answer, and she hadn't pushed for one. But the tension between us was palpable, an invisible wall that neither of us seemed willing to breach. I sat down across from her, the silence heavy between us. Jane stared into her cup, her fingers tracing the rim as if she were trying to find the right words. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression troubled. "Jack, I've been thinking," she began, her voice faltering. "About us. About everything that's happened." I didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air. I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I had been so focused on Julien, on exacting my revenge, that I hadn't really stopped to think about what came next, about what was left of our marriage. "Go on," I said quietly, taking a sip of my coffee. Jane took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I've made so many mistakes. And I know I've hurt you in ways that I can't even begin to make up for. But I want to try, if you'll let me." Her words hung in the air, filled with a mix of desperation and hope. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the way her voice trembled with emotion. But I also felt the weight of everything that had happened between us, the betrayal that still festered like an open wound. "I don't know if we can go back," I said, my voice steady but distant. "Things aren't the same, Jane. You know that." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know. But I don't want to lose you, Jack. I don't want to lose what we had. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, to make things right." I looked at her, seeing the woman I had loved for so many years, now broken and pleading for a chance to mend what had been shattered. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow rebuild our marriage, that the love we had once shared could survive the damage that had been done. But I wasn't sure I could. "It's not that simple," I said, setting my coffee down. "Trust. It's not something that just comes back overnight. It's going to take time. And honestly, I don't even know if I'm ready to try." Jane's tears began to fall, and she quickly wiped them away. trying to maintain her composure. "I understand," she whispered. "But please, just don't shut me out completely. Let's take it one step at a time, see where we can go from here." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I wanted to say no, to tell her that it was too late, that the damage was too deep. But the truth was, a part of me still cared for her, still wanted to believe that there was something worth saving. "All right," I said finally, my voice heavy with resignation. "We'll take it one step at a time. But don't expect miracles, Jane. I'm not the same person I was before all of this, and neither are you." She nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Jack. I promise, I won't let you down." I didn't respond, instead standing up and heading toward the door. I needed some air, some space to think. As I stepped outside, the cool breeze hit my face, clearing some of the fog that had settled over my mind. I wandered through the city, my thoughts a jumbled mess of conflicting emotions. I had gotten my revenge on Julien, but it hadn't brought the satisfaction I'd hoped for. Instead, it had only deepened the chasm between Jane and me, leaving me adrift in a sea of uncertainty. What was left of our marriage? Could it even be repaired, or was I just prolonging the inevitable? I didn't have the answers, and that scared me more than anything else. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain, I couldn't go back to the way things were. The man I had been, the life we had shared, it was all gone, buried beneath the weight of betrayal and revenge. The only question now was whether we could find a way to move forward, or if we were doomed to remain trapped in the wreckage of our past. As I continued to walk, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. Not with Julien, but with myself, with the man I had become, and the man I wanted to be. It was a fight that would take more than revenge to win, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face it. But I knew I had to try. For my sake, and for Jane's. Because if there was any hope of finding a way out of this mess, it had to start with me. It had been a few weeks since Julien's downfall and the collapse of his gallery. The frenzy had died down, the media had moved on to the next scandal, and Paris had begun to forget. But the aftermath remained, a lingering reminder of the chaos and destruction that had unfolded. Jane and I were trying to navigate this new reality. The conversations we'd had since my decision to give our marriage another chance were honest but strained. We talked about our feelings, our mistakes, and our hopes for the future. But the path forward was uncertain, filled with bumps and detours. We began attending counseling sessions together, an attempt to repair the trust that had been shattered. It was grueling work, each session peeling back layers of pain and betrayal, forcing us to confront our own shortcomings and those of our marriage. There were moments of breakthrough, where we could see glimpses of the love that had once bound us together. But there were also moments of deep frustration and raw honesty. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Jane and I decided to take a walk in the park near our home. The weather was crisp, and the fall leaves crunched beneath our feet. It was a small moment of normalcy in a sea of chaos, and I found it oddly comforting. We walked in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jane spoke up, her voice hesitant. "Jack, do you think we'll ever get back to the way things were?" I looked at her, searching for the right words. "I don't know if we can ever go back to exactly how things were," I said slowly. "But I believe we can build something new. It's not going to be easy, and it might never be the same. But if we're willing to put in the work, we might find a new way forward." She nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I want that. I want us to be able to move past this, to find a way to make things work. But I know it's going to take time." "It will." I agreed. "And patience. We have to be willing to take it one step at a time, to rebuild from the ground up." Our walk ended at a small cafe, where we decided to sit and have a cup of coffee. As we sipped our drinks, the conversation turned to lighter topics. Things we enjoyed, plans for the future, dreams that had once seemed impossible but now felt attainable. It was in these small moments, away from the weight of our past, that I began to see the possibility of a new beginning. We talked about traveling, exploring new hobbies, and finding joy in the simple things. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. One of the most challenging aspects of this rebuilding process was confronting the reality of my own feelings. The anger and resentment I had harbored towards Julien were gone, but they had left behind scars that needed healing. I had to come to terms with the fact that my desire for revenge had been a way to cope with my own hurt and helplessness. I started focusing on myself, on finding a way to heal and move forward. I resumed activities that had brought me joy before: running, reading, and working on projects I had neglected. It was a slow process, but each small step helped me regain a sense of normalcy and purpose. Jane and I continued to work on our relationship, building a new foundation based on honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't always easy, there were setbacks and moments of doubt, but we were committed to making it work. We celebrated small victories and acknowledged the progress we made, no matter how incremental. As time went on, I started to see the potential for a different kind of future. Our marriage might never be the same as it was before, but it had the potential to be something new, something better. We were both growing, learning from our mistakes, and trying to forge a path forward. One day, as we sat together on the couch, Jane reached out and took my hand. Her eyes were filled with a mix of hope and vulnerability. "Jack, I know we've been through a lot. And I know we still have a long way to go. But I'm grateful for every step we've taken together. I believe in us." I squeezed her hand, feeling a flicker of warmth in my chest. "I believe in us too, Jane. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But I'm willing to try, if you are." She smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that seemed to light up the room. "I am." As we sat there, holding hands, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were rebuilding, starting anew, and though the journey was far from over, it was a journey we were taking together. And in that moment, I realized that the true measure of our marriage wasn't in the past or the mistakes we had made, but in our willingness to face the future with determination and love. Months had passed since the initial collapse of Julien's career and the subsequent efforts Jane and I had made to rebuild our relationship. The fallout from Julien's scandal had largely subsided, and life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. We were making progress, but the echoes of the past still lingered, reminding us of the journey we had undertaken. One afternoon, as I was going through some old files in my study, I came across a stack of documents that had somehow slipped through the cracks during the chaos of the past few months. Among them was a file labeled Julien Arnaud, Financial Documents. My curiosity piqued. I began to sift through the papers, expecting to find just mundane financial statements or correspondence. Instead, what I uncovered was a detailed record of Julien's illicit activities, bribery, tax evasion, and several shady deals designed to hide his true financial status. It was a trail of corruption that painted Julien in a far darker light than I had initially realized. The revelations were shocking and provided a clear picture of the lengths he had gone to maintain his facade of success. I realized that while I had already taken steps to dismantle his career and ruin his reputation, I now had an opportunity to expose the full extent of his corruption. The discovery was both unsettling and empowering. I knew that unveiling this information could not only bring Julien further disgrace but could also serve as a cautionary tale for others in the art world who might be tempted by similar shortcuts. I mulled over my options. Part of me wanted to take this new information to the authorities, to ensure that Julien faced legal consequences for his actions. But another part of me felt that doing so might be a step too far. A final act of retribution that could perpetuate the cycle of vengeance and bitterness. Jane and I had been working hard to mend our relationship, and I didn't want to jeopardize our progress with another wave of confrontation and scandal. But I also knew that if I kept this information to myself, it would be like leaving the final puzzle piece out of place. That evening, I brought the documents to Jane. We sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light on our faces. I handed her the file and watched as she began to read through it. This is worse than I thought," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was involved in so much more than just a few affairs." I nodded. "It's a comprehensive record of his corruption. I've been trying to decide what to do with it. Part of me wants to expose it, to make sure he faces the full consequences of his actions. But another part of me wonders if doing so would just be another way of seeking revenge." Jane looked up from the documents, her eyes filled with concern. "Jack, this is a serious issue. If what's in here is true, it's important that someone knows about it. It's not just about Julien anymore, it's about making sure that people like him are held accountable." I sighed, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I agree. But I also don't want to open old wounds, not when we're starting to heal. I don't want to make this about revenge. I want to focus on rebuilding our lives, not tearing down someone else's." Jane reached out and took my hand. "We can't ignore this, Jack. It's bigger than us. If we keep it to ourselves, it's like we're complicit in his actions. We need to do the right thing, even if it's difficult." Her words resonated with me. The right thing was often the hardest thing, but I knew she was right. We had spent so much time trying to heal and rebuild that it was important to also stand up for what was just. The next day, I contacted a trusted journalist who had covered Julien's previous scandal. I arranged a meeting to discuss the new information, ensuring that it would be handled with care and integrity. I was transparent about my motivations, making it clear that I wasn't looking for personal gain or revenge but simply wanted to ensure that the truth was known. The journalist was interested and agreed to look into the documents. I provided them with all the necessary information and agreed to cooperate as needed. It was a decision that filled me with a mix of apprehension and relief. I knew that exposing Julien's corruption would undoubtedly stir up more controversy, but I also felt a sense of responsibility to see it through. As the story began to unfold in the media, the reaction was swift. The details of Julien's financial misconduct were shocking, and the public's response was one of outrage. It wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore, it was a broader issue of corruption and dishonesty in the art world. For Jane and me, the impact was profound. The exposure of Julien's wrongdoing seemed to validate the turmoil we had endured. But it also brought a new layer of complexity to our lives. We had chosen to confront the past, to ensure that justice was served, but it also meant facing the consequences of our decisions. In the midst of the media frenzy, Jane and I found ourselves reflecting on our journey. We had come a long way, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, we had managed to build something meaningful out of the wreckage. Our relationship was stronger for having faced the challenges together, and we were beginning to find a new sense of stability. Julien's story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the costs of deceit and betrayal. But for us, it was also a turning point, a moment when we chose to confront the past and make amends, not just for ourselves but for the greater good. As we moved forward, we did so with the understanding that life was not about erasing the past but about learning from it and forging a path toward a better future. The reckoning had been painful, but it had also been necessary. And in the end, it was a step toward healing. Toward finding a new way forward amidst the remnants of what had been. As the dust settled from the scandal surrounding Julien's corruption, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The media frenzy had shifted focus, and the intense scrutiny of our personal lives had diminished. Jane and I found ourselves grappling with the new reality we had created, a reality shaped by our choices, our efforts to rebuild, and the consequences of our actions. With the storm of Julien's scandal behind us, we decided it was time to focus on our own lives, to rediscover what it meant to be together without the shadow of betrayal hanging over us. We had been through a lot, and while the journey was far from over, we were ready to embrace a fresh start. One of the first steps we took was to renovate our home. It felt symbolic, a way to clear out the old and make space for something new. We chose a design that was modern and bright, a departure from the darker tones of our previous decor. The process was cathartic, and working on the project together helped us reconnect in ways that went beyond words. Amidst the renovations, we also began exploring new interests and activities. Jane took up painting, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. She immersed herself in it, finding solace and expression through her art. I resumed my passion for architecture, taking on new projects that challenged and inspired me. We discovered that our individual pursuits not only enriched our lives but also brought us closer together. We started traveling, visiting places we had always talked about but never gotten around to. Our trips were more than just vacations. They were opportunities to explore new experiences, to laugh and enjoy each other's company without the baggage of our past. Each journey was a chance to create new memories and build a stronger foundation for our future. As we moved forward, one crisp winter morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through our bedroom window, I woke with a sense of anticipation. The year stretched out before us, full of possibilities and opportunities. Jane and I had resolved to make the most of it, to focus on our relationship and our individual growth. We had decided to take a break from our routine and spend some time together reflecting on our journey. We planned a retreat to a cozy cabin in the mountains, a place where we could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. It was an opportunity to escape the pressures of daily life and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. As we arrived at the cabin, nestled among the snow-covered pines, we felt a sense of calm and contentment. The crisp, fresh air and the serene surroundings provided a perfect backdrop for reflection and renewal. During our stay, we spent our days hiking, reading, and talking. The quiet and the natural beauty of our surroundings allowed us to engage in meaningful conversations about our future. We discussed our dreams, our goals, and the ways we wanted to continue growing together. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Jane turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Jack, I've been thinking about what we want to achieve in the coming year. It's important to set goals, but I also want us to focus on the things that truly matter to us." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of agreement. I think it's essential to balance our ambitions with the things that bring us joy and fulfillment. We've come so far, and I want to make sure we continue to nurture our relationship and our individual passions. We spent the evening setting goals for ourselves and for our relationship. We talked about continuing our travels, deepening our involvement in community projects, and finding new ways to support each other's aspirations. We also made a commitment to prioritize our relationship, to maintain open communication, and to support each other through any challenges that might arise. As we looked ahead, we realized that the future was not just about achieving specific goals but about living in a way that was true to our values and our shared vision. It was about embracing the journey, with all its ups and downs, and finding joy in the everyday moments. One afternoon, while exploring a nearby trail, we stumbled upon a clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. We stood together, taking in the beauty of the landscape, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life we were building. "This place is incredible," Jane said, her voice filled with awe. "It's a reminder of how beautiful life can be when we're open to new experiences and new possibilities." I smiled, taking her hand. "It really is. And it's a reminder of how far we've come. We've faced so much together, and now we have the chance to shape our future in a way that reflects who we are and who we want to be." As the days of our retreat came to an end, we felt a renewed sense of purpose and connection. The time away had been a gift, allowing us to focus on what truly mattered and to set a course for the future that was both meaningful and fulfilling. Back at home, we put our plans into action, embracing the new year with enthusiasm and determination. We continued to explore our passions, support each other's goals, and build a life that was grounded in love and respect. Our journey had taught us valuable lessons about resilience, trust, and the importance of facing the truth. We had learned to confront challenges with courage, to find strength in our relationship, and to build a future that was true to our values. As we moved forward, we did so with a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance we had been given. We had faced the darkness of our past and emerged stronger and more connected. The future was bright with possibilities, and we were ready to embrace it with open hearts and open minds. In the end, it wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about embracing the lessons we had learned, the growth we had achieved, and the love that had endured despite everything. It was about creating a future that was rich with meaning and fulfillment, and about finding joy in the journey that lay ahead. Together, Jane and I faced the future with hope and determination, ready to build a life that was both beautiful and true. And as we took each step forward, we did so with the knowledge that our love and commitment would guide us through whatever challenges or opportunities came our way.